Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Mikhail Chama. I'm the marketing lead at the Virtual Group, and I'll be your moderator for today. Joining me is Robert Kirtley, CISO at Virtual Group. Robert will be taking us through implementing a cybersecurity framework, sharing steps and insights to help us avoid pitfalls and achieve success. And with that, let's get into it. Robert, over to you.
All right, thank you, sir. And good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm just going to get right into the implementation. As Mikhail said, we're going to talk about tips for success. My name is Robert Kirtley. I am the CISO, head of cybersecurity at Virtual. I've been doing this for 3 decades, very long time, multiple certifications. I've done dozens of implementations, helped companies get a variety of certifications, even going back to my Deloitte consulting days when I was a partner. So what I'm going to set this up with is actually a failure story, a firm that we worked with sometime after they started. But this was a 250-person professional services firm. They were getting demands from their largest clients to demonstrate that their IT environment was secure. The IT director started a project to obtain ISO 27001 certification because that was the thing that was popping up most frequently in the audit requests or the letters and contacts from clients. The sales director assured those large clients that the certification was coming and it was in process and they would have it before the end of the year. The project ultimately floundered. 9 months later, the firm pulled the plug on the project. 2 of the key clients of the firm actually pulled work later that year. The IT director was fired, or actually he did not technically get fired. He was offered the chance to resign, which he did. So we're going to talk about what went wrong and how do you avoid this. One of the key things is making sure that you have a lot of the things. We're going to talk about milestones today. We're going to talk about some of the things that you should be thinking about as you move forward with the implementation of a cybersecurity framework. I've got a cool quote up here. Our goals can only be reached through a vehicle of a plan in which we must fervently believe and upon which we must vigorously act. There is no other route to success. It might surprise those of you on the call with us today that this quote is not from a management guru or an IT visionary. It's actually from Pablo Picasso. And while most of us are not artistic geniuses, it's vital to understand that virtually everything we do, whatever our field of practice or whatever we work on, it's really important to have a plan. We've all heard the sayings that failure to plan is planning to fail, or there's lots of famous quotes on it, but the one thread that runs through all of them is an understanding of the importance of planning and having a plan that's resilient when the inevitable surprise pops up. Good planning should reflect everything we know, but also have the flexibility to deal with things that we can't anticipate and didn't know in advance. So we want to come up with high-level structures so that in the end, we're able to pull together a plan that we can follow and help us achieve the goals and objectives that we set out for the project. There's an old Yiddish saying that says, "Man tracht und Gott lacht." What that means is man plans and God laughs. So today, what we're going to talk about is why you should adopt a cybersecurity framework. This is a little bit of a recap from our prior presentation, or prior webinar on the cybersecurity frameworks themselves. The imperative of implementation framework. We're going to go through a sample framework for implementation, then we'll go stage by stage, talk about some of the benchmarks, milestones, those things that you can go through as you go through a project. So the imperative, again, why adopt a framework? So cybersecurity, there's a lot of principles that we have, but it's important to understand that cybersecurity has a lot of different things that guide why we do and how we do things to ensure the integrity and security of our data and our networks. In terms of organizations, They typically, in our experience, have fallen into four categories when it comes to protecting their applications, network, and data. The first group is people who think that they don't need to worry about it. They're not a target. And the reality is, most of you on the call already know this. If you are watching this call, your organization is a target by virtue of the fact that you are connected to the internet. If you are connected to the internet, you are a target or are a potential target that the hackers can get to. The second group of companies is those that understand that there is a risk, but don't know what to do. They look at the options and they think that it's too complex, too much to do, and kind of throw up their hands and don't really know how to start, so they never start. The third group falls into companies that are protecting themselves. So they've got a series of cybersecurity activities going on, but they don't necessarily have a cohesive information security program. It's not structured to mitigate the highest level risks. I've seen organizations where they focus on things that they're really good at, but that those aren't necessarily the highest risk activities. So for example, they don't spend a lot of time on end user training and end up getting attacked by ransomware. And then finally, fourth, organizations that lack the time or money to invest in cybersecurity or think that they can't afford to do it. We're actually going to address that fourth group in another webinar where we talk about building a business case, documenting ROI, showing that there's real monetary value in implementing cybersecurity initiatives. Because a lot of times people don't really understand how value is measured in cybersecurity. If you look at a good cybersecurity program, a lot of times everybody knows what happens if you're doing cyber well, and that's nothing, right? It's you built a lighthouse and ships aren't crashing. It's really hard to measure the value. So we've got another webinar where we'll talk about that. Today we're going to focus on the cybersecurity framework. So again, this is just a recap of that prior webinar we did, and you can find the link on our website. There are financial benefits. So data breaches are expensive. We talked about that. You want to avoid those. In a lot of cases, for bigger organizations or organizations serving larger clients, they're making demands on you. Show me your SOC 2 certification. Show me your ISO certification. Show me what you're doing, or they send you a 15 or 20 page document where you have to answer questions about your cybersecurity posture. Good cybersecurity can also help you avoid more expensive cybersecurity insurance premiums. One of my clients just we increased our coverage from 4 million to 5 million, and our cyber insurance policy rates went down 22%, despite the fact that across the industry, cybersecurity insurance rates are going up. We were able to demonstrate through our aggressive security posture that we were a lower risk, and thereby we're getting lower premiums. There's operational benefits, improved focus. Your team can be more efficient on addressing high-risk things and working your way down as opposed to just trying to put out fires. There's also error reduction. You're not wasting time, and potentially you're not making the mistake of, and I've seen this before, buying an intrusion detection system and then going out and buying a best of breed endpoint solution, and then going and buying some logging or a SIM tool, and then realizing that the three of them don't work together well. So you can avoid both financial and operational risk from that. Finally, there's compliance risks that you can deal with. You can have compliance with laws, rules, and regs. You can have compliance with your contractual obligations. A lot of organizations that deal with sensitive information often represent that they are compliant with things that they're not necessarily compliant with. You also have a reduced risk of a successful attack and the concomitant damage to your reputation that comes along with that. One of the other benefits from a risk perspective is merely enacting a cybersecurity framework elevates the consciousness of the rest of the employees of the firm. So when the leadership of the firm is talking about cybersecurity and all of the things the organization is doing to improve cybersecurity, other people in the organization come to recognize that, yeah, this is something that's pretty important. So I want to talk about why an implementation framework is important. So On the right-hand side of the screen, we've got some of the key causes of project failures. And a framework helps you avoid most of these issues. So a framework gives you a structured approach. It avoids that missing focus problem. A framework can help you guide your resources. It can help you guide scope to avoid scope creep. A lot of us have worked on projects where we have a very clearly defined scope at the beginning of the project, but over time it expands. So you have content-driven issues, which you can see there. I want to talk about one of the lessons that I've learned, and I'm going to throw this one in here early. One of the other problems I've seen relates to that middle issue on the right, the skills issue. One of the things you should not do if you are implementing a cybersecurity framework, or frankly, implementing anything in cybersecurity, is identify the resources that are available. In other words, the ones you won't miss if you take them off whatever they're currently doing. What that tends to do is your lowest performers end up taking the point for running projects that are mission critical. And that is obviously, when I say it out loud, that is one of the ways that projects frequently fail. Finally, you have execution issues. Implementation frameworks help you mitigate, identify, and avoid implementation issues. They have natural stages, so you have stage gates that you'll go through. And a framework can also serve as a good way of communicating the progress that you're making through the project. So at this point, I'm going to ask Mikhail to pull up the first poll question, and I will turn it over to him. Okay, I'm seeing some interesting things here. Um, so I'm going to go through these. If you could leave this up when folks are done. Actually, I'm just going to start talking about it as folks are voting. Um, Adapting the framework to our specific needs. We're going to talk about that in a couple of minutes. Um, Ensuring efficient resource allocation during implementation. That is actually a challenge because all of us are in cybersecurity, or those of us in cybersecurity who supported maybe in IT. That can be a big challenge because we frequently have this day-to-day operational things that we need to do, but at the same time, we have one-off things. We have issues with uh, we have issues with um, unknown demands coming up. Maybe there is an intense phishing attack. Maybe there is an issue with a server crashing. Maybe there is even a ransomware or some sort of encryption attack happening. So our resources get pulled. So that is a difficult one. One of them, it looks like the highest vote getter here is in fact maintaining buy-in and awareness throughout the process. And one of the most important things to do, we're going to talk about that when we get to the stages and the milestones, but I'm going to talk about and highlight some of the things you can do to maintain buy-in and run communication throughout the project. Finally, that integrating the framework with existing tools is a continuous problem. It's not that unusual. Um, so one of the things that is important to understand when you are selecting security tools is understanding when you might have to make a break. I'm working with an organization now that uses, well, actually, I'm not going to name vendors, that uses a vendor for their XDR, their extended detection and response tool. And we're actually going to pivot because the rest of their ecosystem uses different tools. And we're able to integrate all but that. And sometimes it means making a break with the tool that you're comfortable or familiar with. So thank you all for those who voted. Hopefully I'll address those issues, and if I don't, we do have questions. I'm going to put up the methodology we use. And one of the things I want to emphasize, absolutely, is there is no obligation to use or mimic the Virtual Group's project methodology. This is just the one that we use when we are managing projects and we are running them. A lot of times this is internal, but if the client wants us to manage a project, this is what we use. Any structured approach will work. I worked with another client that was a huge proponent of Six Sigma. So we used the Six Sigma DMAIC framework. Any structured framework will work. What I would insist is that you have a framework that covers all of the phases we're going to talk about, but also has these threads, the ones that are underneath, the budgeting, the quality control, resource management, integration, communications. So a communications plan is how you maintain part of that buy-in throughout and awareness throughout the process. So communication is vital, and it's important that, again, whatever methodology you use, it is not critical that you use Agile or the project management book of knowledge or whatever, the waterfall. Any framework that you and your team are comfortable using is the one that you should use, and especially if it's one that the leadership is familiar with. If they're used to seeing reports in a format where you're talking about, the scrums were conducted for our Agile framework, then do that, because you want to keep speaking the same language that leadership is familiar with. In terms of the broad phases, virtually all of the frameworks have initiation phase. So in Six Sigma, it's the definition phase, for example. So initiation is contracting, budgeting, reviewing if you're using an outside firm. It's coming up with the scope. What are we actually going to do? And this is important to understand. With cybersecurity framework implementation, you often have the opportunity to scope those. Some of you might be familiar, and I talked about this a little bit on the prior webinar, ISO 27001, for example. I've worked with organizations where we very narrowly defined the scope to one geography and our manufacturing facility. We didn't include home office in another country. We didn't include a design facility in another country. Our focus was on implementing ISO 27001 in a geographic region. I've worked with organizations that have also implemented ISO on a functional basis, where we've looked at HR and finance, for example, and implemented the security framework around those functions. So you have the opportunity to scope out what you're going to cover. This is also where you're going to be doing the considerations around some of the other things I'm going to talk about. But what is the organization? How do they want to deal with it? What do they expect from the process? What is leadership? What do they value? What's driving them to fund and support the project? Then you're going to go through the planning phase. This is where you're going to get stakeholder interaction. If it's a broader one like ISO or SOC 2, you need to involve other groups beyond IT and security. You need to have the legal group involved, because there's HR stuff. There's HR group is involved. Compliance is going to be involved. The internal audit function will be involved. So understanding what kind of framework you're implementing is also going to help you dictate, what the stakeholders are and what kind of interaction you need to have with them. You're going to do workshops with folks to kind of get people familiar with what you're doing, why you're doing it. So again, we're going to have a process that we go through on planning. Then you're going to do the resource allocation. Remember, your best people should be on these projects. Backfill, if necessary, with temp contractors. Backfill for your best people so that they can run point and lead these projects. This is a critical, oftentimes for organizations, a make or break kind of a thing to do. Again, a lot of times it's driven by customers or clients of the organization saying, you need to do this in order for us to continue to work with you. Execution. A lot of projects fail here, but it's making sure that you have the ability to manage risk, manage resources, and manage tasks. So you need to have detail-oriented project management, project leadership. This is where you'll start doing your testing. Is this process going to work? And testing can be the implementation of something like multi-factor authentication, or it can be the deployment and rollout of a security awareness training if you're doing one of the higher level implementations of a framework. So execution is going to mean a lot of different things depending on the context. You're going to have the monitoring and control function where you're looking at what's working, what's done, what's not done. You're going to create an issue or a risk register, an open item things. What are things that we need to escalate? What are things that we need to be able to get senior leadership to help us move forward? And then you're also going to have the reporting. This is something where you should have set it up early on, a process for updating your stakeholders. Maybe it's a monthly communication that goes out that says, here's what we did last month, here's what we're doing next month, and here's where we might need your help or your involvement or your team's help or involvement. And then finally, you have the closure, where closure might be, it's going to be different depending upon the framework implementation that you're working on. So if you are working on ISO 27001 or SOC 2, closure might really be obvious. It's going to be the binary event of, did we get our ISO or SOC 2 certification successfully? If it was something more tactical like the Essential 8, it might be something where closure is doing the testing to ensure that we've implemented the controls that we need to put in place. So closure is different things to different folks depending upon the project that you're working on. In terms of key risk considerations, when you're thinking about the framework, the cybersecurity framework that you want to implement, you need to think about some high-level things, need versus want. So for example, if you are an organization that has a lot of intellectual property, for example, you have a lot of critical, maybe you handle customer data, maybe you have a lot of health information. The business need then is going to be quite a bit larger than an organization that doesn't. If you work for a manufacturing organization where all of the value is derived from tools and equipment on the shop floor, maybe it isn't, you don't need to be as aggressive about cybersecurity, and you can do something more basic like the Essential 8. You need to think about organizational readiness. If there hasn't been a concerted effort in your organization to embrace cybersecurity and aggressively do training and the phishing emails and making people aware of cybersecurity issues, then maybe going from a sort of inert state to SOC 2 certification, your organization isn't going to be ready for it. So maybe you take incremental steps. Maybe you implement the technical controls that the IT and security team can oversee with the Essential 8, for example. You might have a consideration of business reach. If you wholly operate within Australia, you may have different demands than if you are also selling or operating in the United States, the United Kingdom, or the European Union, or different parts of Asia, where there might be a higher expectation or even legal or regulatory requirements that you meet certain requirements. The scope is also important. I talked about that a little bit. Understanding what is appropriate for the organization, the depth and breadth to which you want to go. You want to avoid scope creep on any kind of project. That is always the kiss of death. If the scope begins to expand beyond your original control, your timeline will not reflect that, and your resource availability will not reflect that, and more than likely your budget won't reflect that. Make sure that you're, again, aspiring to the right maturity level. Finally, avoid failure. What I mean here is make sure, key thing is that you have leadership buy-in. If you do not have active and supportive organizational leadership for the scope of the cybersecurity framework you're implementing, you will not succeed. You need to have senior leadership buy-in if you're doing ISO, PCI DSS, SOC 2. You can not necessarily require, or at least CEO buy-in if your goal is to do something more tactical. Again, the Essential 8, technology controls that I can largely control within my IT ecosystem with the security team, as opposed to impacting HR, training, legal, compliance, audit, and so on. Obviously, planning and managing, having continuous checkpoints is critical to avoid failure on a project. Approaching a project, you should have clearly defined scope and SMART goals. For those of you not familiar with SMART goals, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-based. Those are all characteristics of good goals. If it's amorphous, I don't know when done, what is done. If it's not, get it done whenever you can, it probably isn't going to get done. So have specific goals with timeframes and make them realistic. Detailed work plan, again, with committed resources, ideally your best people, and then get management and leadership sign off after your initial budgeting process. Keep them updated as you go along. And when you are done, get sign off after you've had an internal review, internal audit, you've achieved your certification, whatever the end state will be. So some example milestones, depending on the phase of the project. I've got some examples here that I've used before. One of the most critical ones is on the project initiation. So it's getting resource approval. It's getting the money, for example. Maybe the money is going to be for hiring contractors to backfill for the people you're going to assign to the team. Maybe it's for hiring a consultant. Maybe it's for buying equipment. Maybe it's for implementing a new learning management system. For example, if you need to track the efficiency and breadth of your security awareness training, whatever it is, understand what the resources you'll need to be successful. Make sure you get approval for that, all of it up front. Define what success means. I cannot tell you how many times I've come into a project where there was no clear definition of when are we done and what defines a successful project. Make sure you have an end goal in mind, and it is objectively easy to be able to say, yeah, we did it, or no, we didn't. Get stakeholder agreement. If you're going to involve other departments, again, HR or legal, for example, make sure that they are in support of the project and that they've bought in as well. More towards the middle, we've got the scope is clearly defined. We've got a testing plan developed. We've got processes defined. So these are examples of milestones that we have used. Training materials developed, that's a later stage because you need to know what processes I'm training on, what tools I'm using, then you can develop the training materials. Staged implementation is critical to be able to say, this is phase one, this is phase two, this is phase three, and so on. Again, whatever framework you're using, they'll have different phases. Finally, you'll get on to the successful testing. Did what we put in place work? Did it break other things? Do the testing, make sure it worked. Have a plan in place. When the project ends, especially if it's a cybersecurity framework, we all have job security because cybersecurity is always evolving. The risk environment is always evolving. Oftentimes, our threat exposure is evolving. Maybe we're deploying new tools. Maybe we're adding in Internet of Things and we're getting remote controls. We're adding devices that are connected to the internet. All of these things create greater exposure for us. So understand that you need to have a process in place so that your cybersecurity framework can incorporate things as things change. At the end here, I've got a potential milestone. Again, this is going to be dictated more by whether or not you're seeking an official certification. If it's PCI DSS, for example, if you are successfully completing your audit so that you can continue to process and host credit card transactions. Maybe your training program. So maybe this is something that isn't managed by IT or security. Maybe this is something that's managed by the HR team and they're using their learning management system to be able to track cybersecurity training. So understand that there may be potential milestones that are relevant for your project and not relevant for other projects. I'm going to turn it over to Mikhail for another poll question. And I'm going to read it. What is the main driver behind implementing a cybersecurity framework in your organization? It looks like the overwhelmingly most popular answer is data breach prevention and improved security posture. Um, Interesting. I'm surprised to see. I guess this is the main driver. I expected to see meeting customer and partner requirements. I have literally implemented information security programs for several, more than a dozen firms um, that had customers saying, "Hey, you literally need to go out and get this certification." Um, so I think it's interesting. But yeah, whatever the reason, whatever the motivation behind it, you're going to get ancillary benefits as well. I know organizations that use their ISO 27001 certification or their SOC 2 cert as a marketing tool. They talk about their organization's commitment to serving their customers, but also protecting their customers' data. So it's something that can serve as a tool that will help you potentially, or your marketing team potentially, um, to get more business for your organization. And in fact, that can be, they're not necessarily going to be involved as a stakeholder, but it might be someone, the chief marketing officer, the director of marketing. That's oftentimes one of the people that we get support from when we're going to leadership saying, we want to do this, and we line up HR, we line up legal, we line up risk. We also get sales and marketing folks saying, hey, this would be a valuable thing to be able to differentiate us as a marketing tool from our competitors. So I've got an example here. This is just a roadmap that, again, similar to some of the things that we've used. So this is one that reflects um, ACSC Essential 8, for example. So we've gone through this process, but one of the things that's important to understand is make sure that you communicate with leadership everything that's going to be going on, that this isn't a 3-month process and then we're done and you'll never hear about it again. That they need to understand that, in fact, it is critical that they understand that this is things that we're going to be updating, refreshing. It will be a living program. We're going to have quarterly things like vulnerability scans. We're going to have annual pen tests. But it's important to understand that these are things that you can do on an ongoing basis. And I just love this slide because I've talked about it so many times. Um, it's important to have flexibility with your plan. And one of the reasons I like this slide is this is a very old slide of Mike Tyson. But the fact that he's going to be fighting on Netflix in a couple of months, I think is really fascinating. But I love the quote, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. This is why you need flexibility with your plan. You need to have folks on the project who run into getting punched in the mouth when they're doing a project. Want to highlight our upcoming webinars. So we've got building a privacy program. We're going to do a deep dive into compliance strategies. And I'm going to talk about one of the ones, building a business case for security. This is something that I talked about very early on, but it's being able to demonstrate what is ROI, or if your organization uses net present value, or an internal rate of return, or maybe you have to have a hurdle rate. So in that webinar, I'm going to be talking about the things that you can use to be able to go and speak finance to your director of finance, your CFO, your CEO. If you're in a publicly traded company, how do you relate what we do in cybersecurity to shareholder value and earnings per share? And oftentimes, organizations are not necessarily good at security organizations especially, and IT organizations especially, are not necessarily good at translating their language. We know what we should do, but it's really hard for us to make dollars and cents out of it to be able to get leadership support. Security awareness. I've been doing security awareness training for multiple decades, and we're going to be talking about what really works. For those of you, again, I'll mention it again. We have another webinar that we did on the cybersecurity frameworks themselves, where we walk through ISO versus Essential 8 versus PCI versus SOC 2. And now I would like to open it up to questions. Mikhail, I'm not sure if I'll see them or if people will say them. How's this working?
It's probably easiest I read them out, Robert.
Okay.
Now, yeah, thanks for that. That was a great presentation. I have a question from Amy. Amy asks, you've shared an example of a failure story. Can you share an example of some companies that do it well, or some projects that you were involved in that went really well in terms of implementing a cybersecurity framework?
Absolutely. So, in fact, that organization where that failed, that was an organization, and I'm not saying you need to hire us. That was an organization that I worked with to be able to successfully implement ISO 27001. And what we focused on is the things that I talked about. We went to the leadership of the firm and said, your clients are demanding it. But your IT director, I interviewed her. I interviewed her after the project failed. She was offered the opportunity to resign. She did. And she did not have support. She couldn't get the resources. The resources that were assigned to her were being pulled onto other projects. At the time, they were implementing SAP. And they kept pulling her resources and saying, oh, we'll give you an FTE. We'll give you 2 FTEs. And I don't know how many of you have worked with organizations like this, but when I work with a team and they say, we're going to give you half of Mikhail's time and half of Sandy's time. And then I go talk to Mikhail and I go talk to Sandy and say, awesome, welcome to the project, really excited. Who's backfilling the 25 hours a week that you're going to be working with me? And then they laugh, shrug their shoulders and say, no, you get 50% of my time, but my regular job also gets 100% of my time. And it's critical that internal resources be involved. Like I've had organizations say, just bring in your team and you do the implementation. That's not how these things work. If we don't understand the culture, which we don't coming in from the outside, your people understand your culture, your organization, and how the team and the firm works. So it's critical to get the resources up front, get senior leadership commitment that they're not going to be arbitrarily pulled off of your project, and then keep senior leadership updated. Establish a cadence. Maybe it's monthly, maybe it's bi-weekly. That's really going to depend on the size of the organization, the bandwidth of senior leadership, but give them, again, it can be brief. It can literally be, here are the 10 things we did last month. Here are the 10 things we're doing this month. Here are the organizations I'm going to impact. Here is who I've identified as a contact. Are those the right people? And if we have issues, do I have your permission to get you involved if they throw up a roadblock? So if you don't have that up front, which unfortunately this director of security or IT did not have with the client I worked with, you're not going to be successful. And without those commitments, I told the senior leadership, I wouldn't take the project because it is going to fail again. So until you can get the upfront commitments on the resources and you have a definition of success, this was a really easy one. This was success is ISO 27001 certification. It's not always that cut and dried, but have a clear vision and a clear articulation of what defines success. so many projects fail because there is no sense of when you're done. You haven't properly defined success, so you just keep kind of dragging on, trying to do more things. You get more stuff thrown at you, and you add those onto the requirements. That's not how good project management works. You need to be able to carefully define and defend your scope up front and then march towards that. That doesn't mean you can't make changes. If something comes up where you need to incorporate something else, that's fine, but you go through the same process, making sure senior leadership will give you the time and the human resources necessary to take on that new requirement, and that the timeline now reflects the addition of a new expanded scope. Does that answer your question, Amy? Oh, I don't know. Yeah, that's right. She can't answer.
I'll give Amy a chance to follow up if she wants
Okay.
to. Thanks for that, Robert. Thanks for that answer. What do you say to an executive who wants to achieve compliance, ISO 27 compliance in 3 months? I guess, I mean, this is the
Wow.
question. I guess it's probably in a generic term is when you're asked for a deadline that seems a bit, uh, let's say, ambitious. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think, well, first, this clearly, unambiguously depends on the size of the organization. The fastest I have successfully done it, it was a 65-person firm, and we did it in 4 months. But I want to make clear that it was a whole team, IT team. It wasn't 65 people on the team. It was 65 people in the company. They had 3 IT people. I had 3 consultants, and we worked night and day. Money was no object, and you would need to tell senior leadership what it's going to take to get there. Most organizations don't have that sort of requirement. I have seen that where a big contract is coming up. I work with an organization, I can't say it. It's a software company that everyone in the world knows. And this was a company that was a vendor of theirs, but they managed some information for this company. And their contract was coming up when they sent out the RFP for renewal. This was their biggest client. They said, we need you to have ISO 27001 certification. The organization didn't have it, and they had about 3 months to get it. They didn't get it. But what we negotiated with the large company was here's the process, here's the project plan, here's the milestones that show we'll have it in 5 months. And then they were a stakeholder. At the end of the first month, we said, hey, this was the plan we told you about. Here's why we're on track. Here's where we are. Month later, here's where we told you we would be. Here's where we are. Here's what we're going to do next month. So it was literally the incorporation of an outside vendor as a stakeholder in the project because it was critical enough. I think it's real. It's not realistic to say if someone throws at you, go get X SOC 2 certification in 3 months, in 6 months. The timeline is going to be dictated by organizational readiness, but it's also going to be dictated by human resources. So if you have a small IT or a small security team, it's not going to be realistic to say we're going to be 50% as a team dedicated to obtaining a certification, because that means your day-to-day functions are going to go, some of the applications are going to atrophy and not function properly. You're not going to get patching done in time, for example. So it's setting a realistic expectation of what can be achieved in a realistic time. But you could throw at them, sure, if you want to do it, it's going to cost this much, and this is how we would do it. And most of the time, they'll give you flexibility, at least as far as I've seen.
Thanks, Robert. Kind of a follow-up question. Would you measure readiness for an organization?
That's awesome. Um, Part of it is just looking at the security culture that they already have. So, for example, I've got into organizations that and probably everybody on the call here already does basic things like quarterly or monthly or a couple times a year you do phishing campaigns. Um, Part of the culture is going to dictate the organizational readiness. But if you've got people that like roll their eyes every time they get one, they don't really, maybe they don't click on the link, but they're also not reaching out to IT saying, I found it. One of the things you might want to consider is a token gift. When you launch a new phishing campaign, maybe do it in stages by departments, for example. Have a competition. The winning department gets a pizza party for whatever has the highest compliance, or catching it and notifying the security team. Or maybe an individual gets a gift card to a local restaurant. So you want to see an organization that already has a cybersecurity level of awareness, and that they've embraced cybersecurity. Everyone sees it as their job, as opposed to people try to figure out how to get around MFA or how to get around their security controls. So a lot of this is just culture. What is the culture of the organization? And you know that about your organization probably better than anyone on the outside.
Thanks, Robert. With I'm not sure with this question if perhaps maybe you can talk about the aspects that they need to look at. I have a question: which cybersecurity awareness program would you recommend? So I'm not sure if we can name a vendor, or maybe you can talk about some aspects to look for.
Yeah, I'm really trying to be vendor agnostic here. Um, so the elements I would look for in a good cybersecurity awareness program is something that engages users more than just the 2-3 minute sessions. Uh, that, honestly, I can tell you that most folks, especially if you have two screens, have it running on one and are doing their work on the other. And for those organizations, it's more of what I call cybersecurity theater. It allows them to check a box that says everyone in our organization has gone through cybersecurity awareness training. I think one of the things that's critical, and this can be hard to do in larger organizations, one of the things that's critical is at least once a year, I try to get all of the organizations I work with to do a live training. And it doesn't have to be in person. It can be in person. If you have multiple locations, it can be in person and broadcast by Zoom or WebEx or whatever, Teams or whatever video conferencing technique or tool you use. But I think it's important to get in a room or get on monitors with people and be able to force them to be engaged. It is so easy in a conference call to look away and do your work. If I'm doing that on a Zoom call, you're going to see the side of my head. And it's going to be obvious that I'm not necessarily listening to you. A live training also allows you to throw questions at people who are on the call or in the audience if you're doing it in a room. So at least once a year, I like to do a live training. Again, oftentimes, especially during COVID, it was inherently remote, but oftentimes that can be done remotely, but it still allows folks to actually engage with you, ask questions. The second thing I'm going to suggest to you is to think about making cybersecurity training something they value. What I mean by that, I'm just going to use an example. A couple of months ago, last November, I would run a cybersecurity class that was titled How to Shop Safely Online, How to Use the Internet Safely for Your Christmas Shopping This Year. And people signed up. And they signed up not because it was the company forcing cybersecurity training on them. They signed up because it was to their benefit. And the good news about that kind of cybersecurity class, they're going to listen. It's in their own self-interest, but they bring those good habits to the things that they do when they're working. Another one, I just ran this about 2 weeks ago, was how your kids can safely be online, How, as a parent, do I make sure my kids are doing what they should be doing and not doing what they shouldn't be doing? Again, this allows me to weave in cybersecurity lessons that will be top of mind, but is in their own self-interest, and again, develops habits that they will bring to work and improve the cybersecurity maturity of all of my users. Hopefully those are some good examples and those make sense.
Thanks, Robert. These are all the questions that came through so far.
Okay.
Would you like to maybe include any final comments before we close, just to wrap us up?
Yeah, yeah, I will. So implementing a cybersecurity framework in your organization is going to be a challenge. I'm not going to downplay it. But you can treat it like any other implementation process, and you should. You shouldn't have any less rigor around implementing a cybersecurity framework than you do around implementing an ERP system or a new shop floor manufacturing CAD system. So you need to have the same sort of discipline because it is as important and as subject to project issues as any other kind of IT or information security project. So make sure, again, you've got the resources, you've got the leadership support, and you have the right team in place to be able to execute.
Excellent, Robert. Thanks so much for this. And thanks everyone for joining. We'll be sharing the recording early next week with you, as well as there's a survey. As you're exiting the software, there's a survey there that helps us get some feedback and provide better webinars in the future. If you can please complete that, we would appreciate it. Thanks so much and have a great day. Thanks, Robert.
Thanks, everyone.